This is probably the perfect time for the former executive director of the NFL Players Association to have a book coming out because, if you haven't noticed, the NFLPA has been in the news a little bit lately. DeMaurice Smith joins us now. The new book, Turf Wars, and let me get the title right, The Fight for the Soul of America's Game. Brand new, just out this week. Congratulations, and thank you for being available today to discuss it.
Well, Mike, thank you. It's great to be on. You know, it was great working alongside you for what, 15 years? Long time.
Long time and a long time ago. I love the epitaph of the book, and the quote is this: "Until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter." Why did you pick that line?
You know, Mike, I think, you know, for people like you and people like me who've, you know, literally are blessed to work in the field of sport, you know, 85% of the stories are one way. It is great to work in football, but, you know, the league has such a loud voice, has such a loud presence. The game is what, 92 of the top 100 shows every year. The Shield drives the message. I wanted to write a story that talked about football and sport and culture from the perspective of someone who battled them for 15 years, and to tell the story of the players outside of what they do on the field. And so that Chidia quote comes from a book called Things Fall Apart. It's one of my favorite books of all time. But, you know, until you can establish your own voice and tell a story from a different perspective, I think people are only getting one side of it, and you need both sides to get at the truth.
They talk about welcome to the NFL moments for players. For you, considering your background, you had been a prosecutor, you'd worked at a law firm, you'd been very successful, you step into this new realm in 2009. What was your welcome to the NFL moment where you realized these are not going to be the easiest people to deal with?
No, I remember two things. One, I met Roger for lunch not long after I took the job. He came down to DC. We met at a restaurant called the Caucus Room, which weirdly was partly owned by my former boss, Tom Boggs. And we had a lovely lunch. It was absolutely fine. And I'll never forget, Roger had a NFL pin on. And he took the pin off and he slid it across the table and he said, welcome to the NFL. And I remember looking at that going, no, I'm not a part of the NFL. And I remember sliding the pin back and saying, thank you very much. And literally, I remember that moment kind of being well, this is what it's going to be moment, because these guys are tough to deal with and they're formidable. And in many ways, they're the most formidable people I've ever gone against in my career. But that was the moment when I realized, okay, I just have to stake out what this NFLPA thing is. And sometimes we can do great things together, but sometimes we have to battle.
There's been so much talk about that balance between being in a partnership with the NFL, but also being in an adversarial relationship. Yep. How did you go about finding that sweet spot, if there even is one, if it's even possible to be in true partnership and true adversarial relationship at the same time with another entity? How did you? I'm picturing a Walenda. You're old enough to remember the Walendas. I'm picturing a Walenda on a wire with that pole trying to balance himself.
That's exactly what it is. I think the only difference is, while you're Walenda balancing yourself on the tightrope, there's somebody throwing bowling balls at you. That tends to be the job. You know, Mike, I was blessed. You know, the guy that really I have to credit to getting my head straight about that balance was Marvin Miller. And I had read his book, A Whole New Ball Game, you know, back when I was in college. And Mike Weiner, who at the time was the MLBPA executive director, I called him up and I said, is there any way that I can meet Marvin Miller, the legendary former leader of the MLBPA. So I met Marvin in his apartment in New York. He had just lost his wife, and we sat down, and I had my book tucked under my arm because I wanted him to sign it. And the first thing he said to me was, "Why on earth would you ever want to take this job? I mean, the NFL owners are brutal. I read about you. You came from a law firm. You seemed like you had a good career. Why would you ever want to take this job?" And for the next hour, Marvin gave me what I would consider to be the boot camp indoctrination of what it means to be a labor leader, and what it means to be the head of a sports union. And it was terrifying. So terrifying that when I got up to leave, I was too scared to ask him to autograph my book. And he never, I'm serious, and he never did. And I walked out the door, and I remember going downstairs, and I got a cab, and I rode away, and I picked up the phone, and I called Mike Weiner, and I said, "Hey, I don't think that went well." And he said, "That's just Marvin." And 2 days later, he called me up and he said, "If you're interested, I'd love for you to come back." So I sat down with Marvin 15, 20 times before he passed. And he was the one that told me that at times, management and labor can do great things together. But management will always be management. They will always want the workers to work longer and for lower amounts of pay. And labor will always want to work in a way where they get a fair job with a decent day's pay. And there's going to be a tension. And he was the one that taught me to just embrace that tension and make sure that it never gets out of whack.
Because there has to be balance, ultimately, between the league and the union. If it gets too far out of whack, that's when you end up with an inevitable work stoppage. That's why I try to tell people, with all the chaos currently happening with the union, here's why you should care. If things get too far out of balance, it's just a matter of time before there's going to be a strike.
Yep. Yeah. And look, those things are normal occurrences in the management and labor workplace. I sat on the board of the AFL-CIO. That was literally one of the best training grounds that I ever had. But, Mike, we know the history. I mean, pensions, fire escapes, workplace safety, the 40-hour work week, all of those things came from unions fighting back on management. And I actually think the sweet spot is if you have a strong union on one side and a strong, management on the other side. If both of those things are equally strong, that's how you avoid work stoppages. If one side believes that they've got an imbalance, you end up in a world where you might have fights that result in work stoppages. But I think I was also helped. You were one of the first people I met in 2009. You knew that on the horizon, the league had already opted out of the 2006 collective bargaining agreement. So in some ways, philosophically, it made it easy. They had already opted out. They were always talking about, locking the players out in 2011. So I really didn't have the luxury of trying to believe that everything was going to be harmonious. And thankfully, I had a great group of player leaders back then. I think about those guys that elected me in 2009, and I was blessed with just guys who understood what the role of a union was. And sliding into that role after Gene was literally the hardest thing I've ever done, but I was just thrilled to have such great people around me.
I mentioned the possibility of a strike if things get too far out of whack, but I'm also reminded of the basic reality that you confronted every day. You've got a situation where management will shut the game down for a year to get what they want. Players, it's proven over time, all the way back to 1987, they want to play football. They want to get paid to play football. The careers are short. The careers are fleeting. Why should I give up a large chunk of my career to help somebody who's going to be in this sport years from now? And when you have that inherent imbalance, it makes it hard to get things done. What would it take to get the players at this point to say, we are going to strike?
Well, I'm not going to predict that because I'm no longer sitting in the chair. And one of the great parts about not being the executive director anymore is it's cut down on the amount of Tums and Maalox that I would chug almost every day. What would it take? I think it always takes players who understand the role of a labor union and understand the sacrifices that players made in the past for them. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. The fights that happen during a collective bargaining agreement or after a collective bargaining agreement, for the most part, impact future players far more than it impacts current players. And I think players have to understand that they are paying it forward. And you think about 87 and you can't think about from 87 to 93 without thinking about players like Barry Sanders or thinking about players like Freeman McNeil or Reggie White. All of those players who literally risked their jobs in order to create the first collective bargaining agreement. And it was out of those fights that literally started in 1972 with John Mackey until 1993. Players need to understand it was 20 years of litigation that resulted in free agency. It wasn't a gift. And I think sometimes, it's my job when I was there, and I think it's going to be the job of whoever sits in the chair going forward. You have to teach players that virtually nothing they have today came as a gift of management. Everything came as a result of a fight. And what will it take players to finally make that ultimate step to strike? I don't know what that is for the current group of players, but I do know one thing. Somebody better find out very, very quickly.
The last time we did this, that we communicated in this format, was October of 2022. And during that session, you broke some news by saying that the union would soon be filing a grievance alleging collusion as it relates to fully guaranteed contracts. So since you were the one who filed it and pursued it up until the moment that you left as executive director, what would you have now? I look, I want to ask you a question you'll answer.
I know.
That's why I'm choosing my words carefully.
I know.
But I find it very hard to believe that if you had been the executive director when the 61-page ruling was finally issued at the end of months of difficult litigation, it would have been stuck in a drawer for months. What would you have done with that thing if you were in the job the moment that the gavel fell, the signature was placed at the bottom of the ruling, dated January 14, 2025, and given to the two sides?
Look, I mean, we're lawyers. You follow the evidence and you follow the facts. And I always try to avoid speculating or putting other people in a box based on what I would do. But given a finding that the management council, which literally runs and controls the entire National Football League, had urged teams to avoid fully guaranteed contracts, I think I would have, well, actually, I know, I would have filed another grievance based on that finding, look to see if there was a class of players that, based on that finding, could have been negatively impacted by that decision by the management council, and certainly would have appealed anything in the ruling that I thought or we thought was inconsistent with the law or inconsistent with the facts. And Mike, you take the evidence that you have, and we had evidence that gave us a basis for filing, and you take the next step. And again, I know, and that while I was the executive director, there were always a few people who wanted to throw out the tagline that D. Smith would rather litigate than negotiate. That was never true, but I was also never willfully ignorant of the history of not only this players union, but the history of every players union that ever existed. You don't have to go far, but if you don't understand the role of Oscar Robertson, and if you don't understand the role of John Mackey, And if you don't understand the role or the importance of Bill Radovich, and if you certainly don't understand how important Curt Flood was to the business of sport, if you are willfully ignorant of the stories of collusion and the fights for free agency in the history of sports unions, um, I don't think that you can be qualified for that job. If you do understand the role of those people over history, you understand that you have an obligation to pay it forward. And that would have been an easy decision for me.
What's the thing you're most proud of from your time running the NFLPA?
Hmm. I think coming in after Gene passed away, and I never knew him, I never got to meet him. I think Gene did a tremendous job with the union, given everything that he had to fight against. And you mentioned it, 87 strike. There was a strike after that. Players crossed the picket line. He kept the union together. I'm most proud of taking the union to that next step and getting to a point where we decided to focus on the things that impacted the daily lives of players. And 2011, the idea that we would drastically curtail the amount of contact in practice, that we would change the economics to a way where there was a guaranteed or mandatory spend to lock in our share of revenue, but also to instill a culture that it was a union that needed to fight in order to make sure that we had our strides. And look, I took the words of the Constitution very seriously. And it was written at a time where the language of the Constitution matched the times. And that Constitution says that it is incumbent upon the players of the National Football League to pursue the goals not yet attained by any means necessary. And I think that that's what I'm the most proud of, that I wasn't there to make friends. I wasn't there to make sure that I had a cozy relationship with Roger or anybody else over on that side. I'm proud that I understood what the job was, and I'm really proud of how we executed it.
We've been talking so much about balance, I need to flip the coin over. You get one mulligan from your time in the chair.
Yeah.
One thing you can do over, what would it be?
I always, I think that after 2015, maybe 2016, 2017, when we moved out of that, that war mode, from 2009 to 2011, where we spent a tremendous amount of time teaching players about the history of the union. And if I had one mulligan that I would do over again, I wish I would have doubled down on continuing that teaching from like 2017 forward, because I think, and personally, I think I dropped the ball there, because you grew, or I grew comfortable that players understood that history and probably gave in to wishes by players at team meetings that they'd be a lot shorter. But 2009 to 2012, I mean, team meetings were an hour, sometimes an hour and a half. By the time I left, we were trying to get team meetings done, somewhere between 35 and 40 minutes. And I wish that I had just simply said, no, we're going to sit here and we're going to learn the history over and over again. Because if you don't, I think players today might not have a clear understanding that they sit in these chairs in the same way that Drew Brees and Jeff Saturday and Dominique Foxworth and Kevin Carter sat in those chairs. And those guys made some of the toughest decisions that any union leader could ever make. And it's incumbent on them to make exactly the same prudent, smart decisions. That would be my
believe, why do you believe that the NFLPA, the rank and file, there's just a perception, reputation, maybe reality, that the players of all the professional sports in America the players in the NFL are the least engaged, the most apathetic. They just want to play football. They just want to do their thing. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think that that's a perception that frankly, I don't think squares with reality, at least for the time that I was there. I've heard it for years. The baseball union went through a strike and they canceled the World Series. And if you remember, they not only made that show of strength, but the other thing that really tipped the scales to give that union the credibility that they were a fighting union is they won 3 collusion cases that were contemporaneous to between 1987 to 1994. I think that the players of the National Football League, when they needed to come together and fight, they did. I was proud of them, especially during Anthem, when we were going through both representing Colin Kaepernick and the challenges of frankly a president that wanted to turn respectful protest into a political moment. Mike, there was a time when we were going through that where I didn't know how the players were going to react. And I don't know if I've ever been more proud than that weekend after someone called all of them, SOBs, that you saw players rise up and make a decision that they were going to stand together. And that's a moment I think that they need to tap into or I guess reconnect with. And it's the job of the executive director to teach more than anything else. I learned that from Marvin. I learned that from Tony Clark. I learned that from Becca Rue. I learned that from Bob Foose. You have to teach. And I think the toughest thing on the sports side, unlike a traditional labor union, you're in a town that has a strong history of organized labor, in your town. And, because of that, it's because someone's great grandfather was in the union, the grandfather was in the union, the father, the mother. And so that continues. It's not that way in the NFL, right? So you have to create a sense of solidarity through teaching and also making sure that players know the difference between things that are purely performative and things that actually matter when it comes to showing your strength. Look, I love social media, and I think social media has a very strong presence, but there is a marked difference between hashtagging or reposting and making a decision that you're going to fight for each other and making sure that the other side knows it. Those are 2 different things.
This is the point where I'm tempted to say last question, but as a former lawyer, that whenever a lawyer says it's the last question, it's never the last question.
Yeah,
never the last question. But let's say David White, the interim executive director of the NFLPA, seeks you out, brings your book so you will sign it, Turf Wars, just like you did with Marvin Miller. The same thing you did with Marvin Miller, David White does with you, and basically says, what the hell do I do next? What would you tell him?
Understand your history. Make sure you understand the people you represent. Make sure that they understand who they are. And then act accordingly. And I think that I sent him a message a couple of days ago. I'm there to help. And certainly I love the union. I love the players. I think the mission is critically important. But if he came to me, I would do exactly what Marvin Miller did for me. Hopefully I would be less scary and try not to hurt anybody's feelings like Marvin hurt mine. But I think that I think Marvin understood that the only way to truly understand this ecosystem is to be shocked into it and dispelling all the myths that you think you may know. And and then to embrace that role of a teacher, and then act accordingly. And when I say by act accordingly, there is no script for this job. The people on the other side are literally the most ruthless, at times diabolical force that I've ever met as a lawyer. And they will come and take things from you. They will do that. And if you don't have, I hate football analogies, but because I was a terrible football player. But if you don't understand, your head on a swivel, you will find yourself absolutely run over.
One more, which of course means maybe not one more.
Yeah, fine.
Something that I think the average fan is going to be interested in, okay, as it relates to the things you're saying. And I could go on and on with you about the really nitty-gritty details of labor relations, but here's something for the average fan. In what year will 18 games be played in the regular season for the first time? What year?
Well, that's going to be up to the players. And I don't have a prediction for that. I do know one thing. I know that in under the 2006 deal, the league had the unilateral right to add several games. And that was just simply a function of the deal. And that was, look, that was neither a right thing nor a wrong thing, but I'm old enough to remember. I'm old enough I don't remember the 12-game season. I mean, I'm not Methuselah, but I remember 14 games, and I remember when 14 went to 16. And I don't think the average fan realized that when we moved from 12 to 14 to 16 games, the players didn't get paid more money. They didn't get a larger share of revenue. We changed that in 2011, and we changed the agreement so that the players needed to approve any increase in their work. And that fast forward to 2020, when we added that 17th game, the league paid roughly $1.6 billion over 10 years for that 17th game. I don't know if or when 18 games comes, but my hope is that if it does, that the players understand that they need to exact not only health and safety offsets for that, but they should be looking at far more than $1.6 billion for an 18th game.
This one will be the absolute last one, and I swear it's not a bit this time. I'm serious. Yeah. If you were in the chair as executive director right now and you find out that ESPN and NFL Media have done a mega deal where the NFL will own 10% of a broadcast partner in ESPN, what would be your first reaction?
Well, my first thought would be, how does that impact the salary cap? Because as you know, the players are paid out of their share of revenue. And the first thing I would want to know is potentially, was there a lower pay price on the rights fee in exchange for equity? If there was a lower, or if there was a demonstrable lower payment for the rights, that simply means that less money was coming in, less cash was coming in for revenue, and that means less cash for the players. So the first thing I would want to know is the structure of the deal and how that could negatively impact the economic welfare of the players.
And if you have to fight, you have to fight. It reminded me of A Few Good Men when Colonel Nathan Jessup says, you want me on that wall, you need me on that wall. Somebody's got to be on that wall, because if you're not vigilant, somebody's getting screwed, right?
100%.
Somebody's getting
100%.
screwed, and it's going to be the players.
Well, let's put it this way. When you look at whether what's happened historically with players' unions, or you look at what's happened historically in America with the decline of labor unions, you can see a precipitous decline in fair wages. You see a decline in pensions. You see a decline in healthcare. And all of that is you can draw a straight line to the declining union membership in the country. It's no different in football, and it's no different in sport. So I loved being on that wall, Mike, but I am certainly glad I'm not anymore. It was far more PTSD writing about it in Turf Wars, but I'm really proud of what we did. And in all honesty, really proud because I'll say this as a shameless plug for you, and I mean it. One of the things that we need in this country, and we certainly need in sports, is good hardcore journalism. And that is something that along with labor unions, you can make a pretty good argument that in America today, that in addition to our other institutions, hardcore journalism is under fire, both from the outside and from the inside. And the work that you and Pablo did over the last couple of months is just hardcore journalism, and the chips lie where the chips lie. But that role of holding power accountable, I think, is perhaps the most important institution that we have left in America. And you should be commended really for the work that you've done for the last 20 years, because it's been a hell of a job.
Well, I appreciate it. As I said to Pablo at the conclusion of our most recent collaboration, real journalism sucks, because real journalism is hard work and thankless, and it sets you up for all sorts of potential criticism and attacks, etc. But for more tales from D. Smith's time on the wall for the National Football League Players Association, order yourself a copy of Turf Wars now. Great stuff in there, D. Thanks so much for your time. Congratulations on the book, and we'll be talking to you down the road.
Thank you, my friend. Take care.
Hi, it's Mike Florio. Thanks for watching PFT on YouTube. Hit subscribe for the latest news and analysis from Pro Football Talk.